Eating a high protein diet or eating too much protein will make you live less long. It will dissolve your bones. It will make you too acidic in your body. It will give you chronic kidney disease. It will give you liver disease. It will make you go fat. My opinion is that all of these things are garbage. And a couple of weeks ago, at the time of recording this, there was a scientific paper which looked at a lot of these myths and really tried to lay bare the complete, utter lack of evidence for many, many of these things. And I'm going to go through these myths today and expose why a lot of them, in fact, practically all of them, if not all of them, I think, are absolute nonsense. And on screen now, you should see this paper, but if you're listening and not watching, it's called The Harms of High Protein Intake. Conjectured, postulated, claimed, and presumed, but shown, ? So, where do we begin? Well, the first thing to say is, before we actually get into the paper and look at all these things, this is really, really important. And people forget this. It sounds so obvious, but what's high? What's high protein? What's too much protein? Like high relative to what? Too much relative to what? These are value judgment statements. And you have to say it's high compared to what? Like if someone says they're tall, okay, tall compared to what? Tall compared to a baby? Or tall compared to, I don't know who's talking about, Michael Jordan, right? There's a big, big difference. And someone says high protein, high relative to what? If it's high relative to the recommended daily guidelines for the country that you live in, which, aren't that different country to country, then, it's probably not that bad of a deal because most dietary guidelines have, in my opinion at least, relatively low amounts of protein in there in terms of the requirements. So higher than that isn't necessarily a problem. Now, if you are under eating protein and then you eat a higher amount, then you're probably eating the right amount, in which case it's good. But if you are eating the perfect amount of your body's requirements and then you double it, and so you're eating higher amounts, now it's probably a bad thing because you don't need all that. So it has to be defined. Anyone that tells you, high protein is good, high protein is bad, whatever, you have to ask them to define it. And immediately, you'll find that their argument very much breaks down very, very quickly. If you can't even define it, what good is the entire argument in the first place? So bear that in mind as we go through everything today. So myth number one is that excess protein turns into fat. And so typically people will say things like, we know that eating more protein than we need means that will then turn into fat. Well, this is one of the myths that was in the paper, and there's a lot to be said to it. So the first point is, and I've got a few things written down here so I don't forget, but the first point that I wanted to make was when you're in a state of not eating enough food, okay, typically this can be defined as an energy deficient state, which technically is not correct, but when you're not eating enough, shall we say, if you have more protein in that state, then potentially you can actually decrease the amount of fat that's created using a process called de novo lipogenesis. Why is that? Well, if you're not eating enough protein and then you get the protein in there, the body needs the protein. Why would it take something it needs and turn it into something else, which is not absolutely required at this moment? And so that immediately tells you it's not as simple as saying more protein intake means more fat production. If you are not eating enough, your body will just use it as protein. And that's just common sense. Frankly, you don't need any scientific degree or anything to understand that one. So universal statements in this context, I don't think cut the mustard. You have to be specific about what metabolic state you're describing. And as well as that, protein is less likely to be stored as fat as carbohydrates are, or actual fat, assuming you are under standard normal metabolic conditions. What do I define as normal? That's a lecture for another day, but I think we can kind of guess in this video. So if you're not eating too little, you're not eating too much, and you're eating, what your body requires, then eating protein then isn't really going to have that much of an effect in terms of turning into fat as actual fat or carbohydrates, which then turn into the fat afterwards. It can be converted in a process which I won't go into today. So overall, the key here is the context matters, right? The metabolic status or energy status of the individual, I believe that status and the amount that they're actually eating, that's the key factor here. So based on that individual status, the body then will do this or this or this when given certain products to work with. So for example, if you're starving, you're going to use the protein for functions that you need, like for actual bodily function. If you've eaten too much and you're absolutely stuffed and your body has no more requirement whatsoever, then possibly, yeah, it might be turned into something else because it's fulfilled its protein requirement. And so what's important is not eating protein and saying that goes to fat. It's looking at the individual and saying, what is the context in that situation? Okay, well, that situation or this situation will lead to this change or that change. That's actually the way things go. To blanketly say eating more protein turns to fat, completely invalid in my personal opinion. So the second myth is high protein raises diabetes risk, quote unquote, via insulin signaling disruption. So essentially, people say that if you have an excess of protein, that raises your risk of diabetes because the amino acids, they affect the signaling mechanism, which is using insulin. Now, there's a lot to say about this. First of all, the word risk, right? You can't use that word here because it's just not right. You may be able to say the word association at best if you can demonstrate an association, but because you can't control all the variables in an experiment when it comes to nutrition, you can't use the word risk. It's just completely scientifically invalid. So in the paper, which was on screen and is in the description below as well, they showed one study which talks about this. And the study was, I'm probably saying this incorrectly, apologies if I am. The name is ANCU. Is it Ansu? I don't know. Anku et al. Now, they said that this depends on the dietary model or the dietary context and the way the experiment was designed, which makes sense, right? If you don't control for that, how do you know it's the input of protein rather than the starting metabolic state of that particular individual? You have absolutely no idea. And this paper showed that, while complex 1 of mTOR, which is a whole different lecture for another day, and hyperinsulinemia, which is where your serum, your blood levels of insulin is raised to a very high extent compared to normal, while that might show a link mechanistically, high protein diets are also shown to improve insulin sensitivity via weight loss. Now, this is a statement that I've read from the paper. I don't fully agree with the validity of the wording used because, insulin sensitivity, well, how do you measure that? There's no device where you plug a patient in and says the sensitivity is 7 out of 10 or 8 out of 10 or however you would measure it. And so some of the words aren't particularly valid in that statement, but I get what they're trying to say. So mTOR, this is a piece of machinery within each cell. And it basically dictates the protein synthesis, amongst other things. It is like the brain of the cell, if you like. The DNA is not the brain. The DNA is the recipe book for proteins. mTOR is basically deciding, do we make things, do we build things, anabolism, or do we break something down, catabolism? And anabolism and catabolism together are your metabolism. So mTOR is crucial to your metabolic function. And one of the inputs into the machinery, amongst others, like growth factors and amino acids and all these things, insulin is actually one of the input mechanisms. It's one of the pieces of information that mTOR receives, along with other pieces of information. And based on the collective totality of information it receives, it will do this or it will do that. It's not as simple as saying, oh, well, this one this one piece of insulin has come up, let's do this. No, insulin in the context of everything else has this effect or that effect. So you can say that hyperinsulinemia and mTOR complex 1 are linked because insulin is one of the input mechanisms into mTOR. However, the fact that the paper is saying, and I'm trying to quote here if possible, high protein diets are also shown to improve insulin sensitivity via weight loss. Weight loss is not necessarily a good thing, right? Body composition optimization is always a good thing. And if you are able to achieve that by good means, a healthy means, then of course, everything is going to be healthy, including your ability to respond to insulin in a way that a person with normal metabolic function would respond. And that might involve a high protein diet by way of association and what you're doing. But again, high, most likely it's just high relative to under eating, which may have been what they were doing before because they were eating junk food perhaps. So it's a complex statement that, but I understand what it's trying to say. And so what we can say afterwards, and again, I'm trying to quote, net effects depends on overall energy intake or overall food intake. the source of the protein, and what you're replacing in terms of macronutrients. So if you're cutting down on one particular macronutrient and replacing that with protein, it depends what you're replacing as well. But overall, to say that you're going to disrupt the insulin signaling mechanism just because you have high protein, it actually makes no sense whatsoever. The biggest driver of insulin release or increase in serum levels of insulin, I should say, relative to glucagon, is dietary carbohydrates. And so if you cut that down and then you have a high protein, high fat diet, well, it's not going to disrupt the insulin signaling at all because you're cutting down on the carbohydrate intake completely. So again, it comes down to not are you having more protein, but what is your overall diet? What is every single thing you're eating, and how are you changing? What are you changing to? What's your metabolic status? It's much more complex than just saying, oh, if you have more protein, disrupts insulin. It's not that simple at all. And I think this paper does a good job of showing that. Myth number 3, protein causes acne, anger, IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, colon cancer, DNA damage, etc. Yeah, I wonder what the etc. stands for there. So this paper quotes, and I'm going to try and read the quote word for word here, quote, other negative effects, ... anger, acne, IBS, colon cancer, ... It's appalling to say that high protein causes those things or puts you at risk of those things. That's completely scientifically invalid, again, because there is no experimental model which proves that at all whatsoever. And as the paper says, these associations are speculative and poorly evidenced. Second line, the authors stress that causal relationships are not demonstrated. Absolutely correct. Now, an association is completely different to a causal demonstration or an experimentally proved causality. And all the things that I just mentioned, none of those have been linked to protein in a direct cause and effect way. None. Absolutely none. I've not read every single paper ever written in the history of mankind. In fact, I don't think anyone has. But due to the limitations of scientific experimentation, it's actually possible to say very easily that has never been proven, the link between protein and that list of things that I just said. And as this paper has shown, after looking at all the papers, or as many papers as they could, causal relationships are not demonstrated. Associations are speculative and poorly evidenced. So there's no proof whatsoever that high protein causes any of those things. And the conclusion of the authors of this paper on this myth is more research is needed, and these are often taken out of context or based on unverified claims. The context is key. Sounds obvious again, but actually when you look at a paper, it goes out the window. What are they eating to begin with? What's their metabolic status? All these things are so important when you're trying to measure what effect a particular food or macronutrient group has on the body. Because if someone's in a metabolic state of starvation, whereas someone is in the opposite and they're fully satiated, giving them a particular macronutrient is going to have a completely different effect. So it's not the macronutrient you're giving them that has this effect or that. It's the combination of the macronutrient you're giving them plus the way they are to begin with. And there's multiple input. It's not a binary system. And so you have to account for all of these inputs in the system, change just one, and then you're like, okay, well, that's the change that would cause if you were changing just one on its own, which doesn't relate to the real world because you'll never be able to change just one. So any paper that says, it causes whatever the list was here, acne, anger, IBS, colon cancer, DNA damage, zero proof, zero causality whatsoever. Next myth. Myth number 4, protein harms bone health via calcium loss. So essentially saying you have more protein, then you lose calcium and your bones become weaker. This is nonsense, in my opinion, at least. My opinion is you should not listen to anyone that tries to convince you of this, right? Just look at how long people have been carnivore. Are they falling over every 2 yards from constant bone fractures? No, they are not. Okay, I have been properly carnivore. I say properly, probably 90 to 95% carnivore for probably around a year and a half now. I'm not falling over because of weak bones, right? My lifts are going up in the gym. Like, I don't have massive amounts of calcium loss going on. So just real life patience are all you need to see this isn't true. But, it's something that people believe. And so this paper did look at it. And so they essentially showed that even though the increase in the protein intake increases the amount that you see in the calcium, which is called hypercalciuria, that doesn't necessarily relate or correlate to actual loss of calcium in the actual bones as well. So what they're saying, hypercalciuria and bone loss, they don't necessarily cause each other, or link to each other. There's no evidence for that. And so what they've also said is that multiple studies show higher protein intake is associated with increased bone mineral density, sometimes it's shortened to BMD in papers, and less fracture risk if calcium intake is what's needed or adequate. So essentially what they're saying is, it's not about whether you have more protein, yet again, it's about the context of everything you're eating and you as an individual at the point of you having the higher protein intake. And so the fact that certain studies will actually show an increase in bone mineral density, not a decrease, which is the exact opposite of this myth, shows you very, very clearly that it's not as simple as saying protein causes this. Because you've got two studies looking at an increase in protein, and they show the exact opposite effects on calcium, then clearly it's not as simple as saying, well, protein causes this or protein causes that. It's about saying protein in this context can make that happen, in that context can make this happen. That's the correct way to look at it, in my opinion, at the very least. And the authors say, no evidence supports protein-induced acid load causing bone loss, which I agree with. There is no cause and effect evidence whatsoever. I think one of the key requirements, and this is just an opinion now, one of the key opinion which many people will share, one of the key requirements for bone mineral density to be of good quality is things like, for example, obviously how much calcium you're having, because the calcium's got to come from somewhere. We can't make it ourselves. But also good metabolic function, good amount of sunshine hitting our skin. We need that vitamin D, and good amount of good quality fat in our diet, because the fat contains vitamin K2. And the K2 in combination with vitamin D3, that pathway allows us to ensure the movement and positioning of calcium correctly in the body. So we can have things like matrix GLA protein, which take the calcium out of soft tissue. It should never be in soft tissue, like vessels. That's when we have hardening of arteries. And it puts it into hard tissue, like bones and teeth, where it is meant to be, using enzymes like osteocalcin. However, if you're just looking at protein intake and you have no idea how much sunshine this patient is getting, how much fat they're eating, etc., and it's all different, well, then you're going to get completely different results. If you control every variable and then you change just one at a time, then you can draw some meaningful conclusions, but you can't. And that's why you can try and control just the protein, but if you don't control everything else, one study will find it does this and the other study will find it does that, because you haven't controlled the real required factors to show good quality experimental proof. And so this thing about bone loss, don't believe it. I think it's absolute rubbish. It is my opinion, but I think common sense will tell you that, it's most likely true. So myth number 5, high protein reduces lifespan. Okay. This is generally based on rat studies, and some of those rat studies show that when you restrict their protein intake, those rats, not humans, rats, could potentially live a little bit longer. Now, I've heard this many times. I have taught now well over 10,000 doctors around the world. I'm sure many of you watching this, I have taught you personally. And I get this question a lot, or shouldn't we have less protein intake? And I say, well, why? And I say, well, studies have shown that if you restrict the protein, they live longer. And I say, okay, well, what human studies are there? And they go, well, I don't know. And it just falls apart instantly. And what you do in the rats doesn't translate to humans, right? And this paper lays out really well some of the reasoning why that's a stupid idea to try and do that. Now, I've done a video on mTOR on this channel. Go have a look for it. Once you see what mTOR does, okay, basically cell function in every cell of your body, and that it works by having enough information sent to it, information in the form of amino acids, to restrict that, i.e. protein, is a dumb idea. But let's see what this paper had to say. So essentially they're saying that the data on these rat studies is mixed. If you actually look at those studies, instead of just listening to what someone, told you at work or whatever, they're saying that some of those studies show that protein restriction extends life, whereas other studies attribute it mainly due to just restricting what they're eating in total, right? So things like nutrient restriction or eating less junk food, perhaps, if you do that as a human being, yeah, you're probably going to live longer. Is it because of less protein or eating less garbage? Which is it? The only way to prove that is to increase the protein and cut out the garbage, in some kind of equivalence. and then see that actually you live even longer if you increase the protein, but you cut the garbage out. But we can't do that. It's impossible to have that kind of study done. And this paper also says that in humans, evidence is inconsistent and observational studies are confounded. And that's why you can't do these studies. They're confounded. There are too many variables for you to be able to control, such that you can only change one variable, which is the protein increase. Now, the thing is, a human being is only capable of eating so much for obvious reasons, right? And so if you increase that protein, what are you removing to increase that protein? That makes a difference as well. And so because of all these confounding variables, utterly impossible to do a study like this. And this paper also saying protein leverage, in other words, protein leverage. If you don't eat enough, then you may overeat protein because you're in a state of starvation, okay? So protein leverage may actually shorten lifespan. If you don't eat enough protein and your body just makes you hungry to try and get enough protein in, and you just overeat whatever you can because you're hungry and starving, that can shorten lifespan. If someone tells you less protein makes you live longer, how many studies can they then show you this particular effect? You have to look into the data, and this is the reason why. And so overall, this paper says that no robust data shows high protein diets reduce human longevity. Absolutely correct. Now, I'll go one step further and play devil's advocate against myself and say there is no robust data showing that low protein diets reduce human longevity as well, because there is no study anywhere that can inform on human longevity. It's impossible. Absolutely impossible. Unless you've got that person from the womb in a locked room with their identical twin, where they do everything the same except one thing, and they have different lifespans, then you can say, wow, well, if you do this one thing, you live longer or you live less. And you've done the correct experiment to prove that. But we can't do that practically, logistically. And so there are no studies that inform on longevity. But even these rat studies, they show mixed results for the reasons which I've just shown here, which is pretty common sense in most of it. So, myth number 6, high protein diets cause type 2 diabetes. Now, the quote from the paper is, animal protein intake is associated with type 2 diabetes risk. I've never heard such nonsense, right? First of all, forget what the paper says. Okay, let's just work through this with common sense. What is diabetes, right? It's where the level of glucose in your blood is higher than, and I'm not saying high, I'm saying higher. It's higher than what your body would naturally have it at if homeostasis was left to its own tools. What's homeostasis? It's the processes of your body being left to its own tools and everything being exactly as your body requires it to work perfectly. So homeostasis would have your body level of blood sugar around 5 grams across the whole body, depending on the size of the person. So diabetes is where the level is higher than that 5 grams chronically, so over a period of time consistently. And then we can term that diabetes. Now, just that alone should tell you the amount of nonsense in this myth. It's not elevated levels of protein, it's elevated levels of sugar, glucose, which is a carbohydrate. So if you have high protein, again, what's high? You have to define that, whatever that may be. Let's say you have high protein, but you don't have carbs. How can you get diabetes? If diabetes is defined as elevated levels of carbohydrate, of glucose in the bloodstream, but you don't increase that level because you don't eat any, so it just stays at 5 all the time, how can the high protein cause diabetes? And how can protein cause any problem with increased levels of carbohydrate when it's a protein, not a carbohydrate? Having more carbohydrates causes more carbohydrates to be in the bloodstream. That's pretty obvious. A child can figure that one out. So it makes no sense whatsoever for people to say that higher protein diets, whatever their class is high, cause type 2 diabetes. You may find some weak association if they're having that high protein with high amounts of carbs as well, but that's a different kettle of fish altogether. So what this paper says is, after looking at the data, after looking at these things, many studies are observational using food frequency questionnaires which are prone to confounding, which is true. So essentially what they're saying is, if you're trying to draw a link between this in your diet and that in your medical diagnoses, well, the way you try and draw that link is you simply look at people who have a particular disease or a particular population, and you say, what do you eat? Oh, you eat this. Okay, write that down, write that down. Oh, and you got diabetes. Okay, well, this must cause this. But here's an experiment. I'm going to ask you a question right now, and I want you to think of the answer in your head straight away. No going around trying to really mull it over. You've got to answer straight away in a couple of seconds, okay? I'm going to ask you 2 questions, in fact. So the first question is, what was the last thing you ate? The second question is, how many times did you have juice in the last year, assuming you had juice? Now, you may be able to remember the last thing you ate because you just did it. Fine. But if I said, how many times have you had juice in the last year, assuming you have juice, obviously, if you don't, then you know the answer is 0, then you've got absolutely no idea. But that's what these kind of questionnaires go through. They say, how many times did you have this last month, last week, last year? Like, there's no reliability. And so how can you draw scientific conclusions on something where there's no reliability as one of the variables? It means your conclusion has no reliability either. So the paper's right. Many studies are observational. They use questionnaires, and so it's just not reliable whatsoever. Second point they made is that these randomized controlled trials have no consistent negative effects of red meat or animal protein on, they call it insulin sensitivity. I'm going to say the ability for the cell to respond to the insulin in a way that someone with normal metabolic status would respond, because sensitivity, it's subjective. You can't measure that. So no consistent negative effect of red meat or animal protein on the ability to respond to insulin. Like, what do you expect? Insulin is not triggered by protein intake or meat intake in the same way that dietary carbohydrates are. The biggest trigger to increase the level of insulin, at least relative to glucagon in the bloodstream, is dietary carbohydrates, not protein. The third point they made was some studies showed neutral or even positive effects when protein replaces sugars or carbohydrates or refined carbohydrates, I think they said, and added sugars. Well, what do you expect? If you take those carbohydrates out, you take out the trigger for increasing the level of insulin relative to glucagon in the bloodstream. And if you take them out and replace them with protein, of course, the body's metabolic status is going to improve because there are no essential carbohydrates. There isn't a single one, which means we don't need to eat them because we have a process called gluconeogenesis that makes them for us to maintain the perfect level at all times. So if you take that out, of course, insulin is not going to be released much now compared to before. And as a result of that, your level of hyperinsulinemia, if you have that, which is chronically elevated insulin level in the blood, is now going to drop because insulin isn't needed anymore because you've taken out those carbs. So in that context, adding in the protein in the context of replacing the carbs actually improves your metabolic status, and it will reduce the likelihood that you will develop diabetes because diabetes is chronically elevated glucose and you're not putting the glucose in your mouth. It's not complicated. Myth number 7, protein causes kidney damage. And what they say is high protein diets harm kidneys even if they're healthy, not just kidneys which are already damaged by some reason. And this is what you call the Brenner hypothesis. And the Brenner hypothesis, which is that protein causes kidney damage, doesn't have any human data whatsoever behind it. And the paper actually goes into this, and you can see that. What they actually say in the paper is short-term increases in what's called GFR, which is glomerular filtration rate. This is basically the kidneys doing their job, shall we say, right? So if the kidney's doing their job, if the rate of that increases in the short term, that's actually a normal physiological response. So for example, let's say you get hot and you start sweating. Sweating is not a pathology. Sweating is just a physiological response. And so if a kidney, or a pair of kidneys even, if they filter more, that's not a problem. It's them doing their job. Because if there's more to be filtered because you're eating more, well, then they're going to do more work, aren't they? That's not a disease. That's just normal function. And so why this has been seen as a pathology or talked about like a pathology makes no sense to me personally. And this paper also said that meta-analyses, this is basically where you take a study of studies, if you like, And Mendelian randomization studies show no causal link between protein intake and kidney disease. And yeah, I'd expect that, because you can't show a causal link between what someone eats and what effect it has on their body, good or bad or neutral. Long-term studies in resistance-trained men eating more than 3 grams per kilogram a day of protein showed no kidney harm. Now, it's very hard to do controls in studies like that, so I will play devil's advocate against myself again. However, the fact that they couldn't find an association in that group when they were eating more than 3 grams per kilogram in a single day and any harm done to the kidneys show that it's not to do with whether you're increasing the protein. Yet again, it's about the context. In that particular group, in resistance-trained men, they're probably going to be not as metabolically unhealthy as the typical person on a standard Western diet, shall we say. Possibly. I'm just guessing here. And as a result of that, if they have high protein intake, it did nothing. But if you have high protein intake and you're not in that group, then it's something entirely different. So context matters. You can't just say high protein causes this damage. It's just not valid. And the paper also says recent meta-analysis shows higher protein intake may even lower the risk of chronic kidney disease in healthy people. And again, first of all, risk, you can't use that word, but you have to look at the context. So if these people who are increasing their protein intake see that, is it because of the protein intake, or is it because they're dropping something else like unhealthy food to then replace it with the protein, and that's what's causing the improvement in their health? Well, you don't know, because you can't do that study. So to blanket outright say protein causes kidney damage, not scientifically valid whatsoever. Myth number 8, there is a safe upper limit, quote unquote, for protein. And essentially what this paper is referring to is the myth that even if you're healthy, there's if you go beyond a certain amount of protein, there's a risk associated with that, shall we say. Now, the problem with that is, again, forget the paper, just look at common sense for a second. There's a safe limit for everything. Water, exercise, even the opposite of exercise, sitting and doing nothing. Like, if you go beyond the safe limit of anything, well, then you're not safe anymore. Forget protein, just in general. It's like saying, if you give yourself a problem, you now have a problem. It's the most useless statement I've ever heard. I mean, I've heard people say, this diet may be good, that diet may be bad, but actually, if you look at any diet, if you eat them to excess, then it can cause all sorts of problems. Yeah, because you've just made the person eat it to excess. Eating to excess is the problem. So what you're saying is, if you give yourself a problem, you have a problem. This is a useless statement, and it needs clarification. But anyway, the paper here, they says no compelling evidence exists to define a specific upper safe limit in healthy individuals. Absolutely, because everyone is so different, you can't come up with a single number. And even then, that number, if you somehow could, do you think it's going to be the same every day? No, it's going to be different every single day. Hence why when we eat food, we don't always get hungry at the exact same point every time. If we have a greater need for resources in the body, then that feeling of being full will come a bit later. If you've got no requirement whatsoever, it'll probably come a little bit sooner. That's our body realizing the amount that we need is changing on a daily basis, or on a meal-to-meal basis, even within a day. And so to define an upper safe limit, it doesn't even make sense, because that's going to change on a daily basis, like I said. And the paper also said, most people struggle to reach even 2 grams per kilogram of body weight in a single day of eating, well within dietary guidelines. And so even if you hit the practical upper limit, not the safe upper limit, the practical upper limit of around 3 grams per kilogram per day, like I said, in healthy, active people, it showed no harm whatsoever. So the safe limit, to try and define a safe limit for the whole species, for a whole nation, is absurd. You can't do it. So the final, section of the paper, after they went through all of these things, and I'm going to quote for you now, they said, the burden of proof now lies with those proposing that high protein intakes are harmful. Absolutely correct. Because if you're going to say this is harmful, where is your proof? The fact that, they say it shortens lifespan, But some studies show that actually it does the opposite. The fact that they say, and I say they, it's just commonly purported myths, that it causes damage to kidneys. And yet when you go much, much higher protein than, let's say, the dietary guidelines, they show that if, depending on the type of person you are, it can have absolutely no problem whatsoever. They say that it can lead to diabetes, but actually in some studies you can see that diabetes is decreasing if you do things properly. All of these things require context. And sadly, the context isn't always explained in each individual conversation. And when someone reads a study, to know that it's context dependent and what that context is and all the variables required for that is what you need in your head in order to be able to criticize that paper. So remember, the public may read a paper and says, oh, look, this says high protein causes kidney damage. Oh, there we go. This is why you shouldn't eat protein. But a member in the scientific community who does this for a living will know all the variables that I talked about today. And they'll look at that paper and they won't go, oh, okay, well, it causes kidney damage. They'll say, okay, but you didn't look at this variable and this one and this one and this one, and you didn't control this and this and this context. Therefore, the conclusion is invalid and unreliable. And so that's why you have so many different opinions in this world. Some people will just say, oh, this paper said this. Other people will say the opposite. And it's because of this ability or inability to critically appraise a scientific paper. And in fact, that's a technical term. It's called a CASP, C-A-S-P, critical appraisal of the scientific paper. When I went through university, this is one of the things that we had to learn. Sadly, in nutrition, I don't see it done very often. And as a result of that, we have some of the myths, I'm sure these aren't all of them, some of the myths that we saw in this paper today. So don't fall for them. It's much more contextualized than you think when it comes to nutrition. Anything in nutrition is entirely dependent on not just what is being given to the subject in the study, but the status and the context of that subject in the first place. And because of that, we can't control all the variables. And because we can't control all the variables, we can't attribute cause and effect to what we're trying to give that patient and what we're trying to measure. As a result, in nutrition, there is no cause and effect studies at all. If you want cause and effect, then we have to look at paleobiology and biochemistry because they're facts and they're observable. And it's the same for the entire species. And so that, if you want to draw conclusions about nutrition, is the way to go, not associations and myths like any of this. Now, this actually came, the idea for this video actually came from my school group where we teach this kind of thing. And we break down these myths so people don't have to sit there thinking, well, who do I listen to now? We actually just break down the biochemistry and they can decide for themselves. If you're interested in learning things like this and going deeper into each myth and the actual biochemistry of it all, the link to the school group is in the description below. And hopefully I'll see you there.